Hello, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. I'm Justin Essery, an Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Wake Forest University. The IMC is a periodic, online, interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and also sponsored by Springer Publishing. This week's speaker is Theresa Gessler of the University of Zurich, giving a talk entitled Wikipedia as Big Data for Political Research. The talk will last between 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You can ask a question during the talk using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. And you can ask a question at any time during the talk, but we will save all questions to the end unless they are very immediate, like I can't hear you. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box. You can also raise your hand using the little raise hand button. Otherwise, I will read your question aloud during the Q&A period. A link to Theresa's slides will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you can refer to it throughout the presentation. And now I'd like to welcome Theresa Gessler to the IMC. Welcome.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present, and thank you very much for being here on what is, I think, for you a Friday lunchtime, for me a Friday evening already in Zurich. So to give you a quick outline of my talk, I will start by basically reminding you what is Wikipedia, because I think you wouldn't have made it here without knowing what it is, but reminding you of some of the key facts about it, talking a bit about what Wikipedia data and political research. So basically, how has Wikipedia been used in political research so far? And what do we have to consider when we want to measure things from Wikipedia? The too long didn't read, or maybe too long not listening version of the talk is that I'm arguing that Wikipedia offers new possibilities of measurement for three types of concepts. The first being representation and bias, the second interest and attention in different things, and the third framing and stereotypes. And I'm trying to guide you through how we can make two types of inferences, basically similar to how we think about making inferences from survey data and based on the total survey error framework, basically arguing that on the one hand, it's about measurement and how we measure phenomena from this data, but also about representation. How can we make inferences to a larger population? Substantively, I want to talk a little bit kind of on the sidelines about some applications that stem from my research, basically to make this more interesting and easier to follow. And they are mostly about differences in the portrayal of and interest in female and male politicians. So I will also talk a bit about what Wikipedia reveals to us about that. Okay, let's start step by step. You surely already know that Wikipedia is a large collaborative online encyclopedia that was founded in 2001. It has a very comprehensive topical coverage, and actually what I found always really impressive to think is that the content of Wikipedia basically is equivalent to 30,000 volumes of a printed encyclopedia. What is important to highlight about Wikipedia is that it's a volunteer project that is shaped by its editors. So this means it's very versatile and it can adapt pretty quickly, but it's also shaped by the biases that the editors have, and actually researching this bias is one of the things that many people are interested in on Wikipedia. I also quickly wanted to highlight that there's multiple language versions, and the page is actually among the most visited websites in many of the countries and really used by large segments of the population. It's a bit difficult to quantify because we don't really have representative surveys that ask about this, but it is definitely one of the top sources for things. There are a few readership surveys that basically study people who agreed to participate in a survey when being on the Wikipedia page. And they showed two things that I think are interesting to highlight, namely that it's extrinsic motivations for most people. So for example, we hear about something in the media, we talk to someone, and then we decide to look that thing up on Wikipedia. but also some intrinsic motivations, like people want to learn about something, they look up the Wikipedia article. So this is just the stuff to keep in the back of your mind. To give you a few numbers on that, and then I'm done with the kind of part that you probably already know. Wikipedia has over 300 language editions. I've plotted kind of the development over time in article numbers for some of the most important ones, just to give you an overview that English is really the kind of most important language edition, but other language editions are also growing, and many of them have over 1 million articles. To also give you a bit of a quantitative overview in how is Wikipedia used, basically per month around 10 billion people end up on the English Wikipedia page, or 10 billion visits to the page happen, and they follow a cyclical pattern. I'm not sure how clear the graph is on that, but I find it interesting to think about this in terms of why and how do people actually use this platform. But basically we see this is a whole week plotted, kind of a pattern with the weekend having less traffic, but people when they're at work, in school, using the platform more, and also using it more in winter than in summer, because we're more likely to be inside and maybe search stuff on the internet. A big exception is the year 2020, where you can see that basically during each month, given that there were so many lockdowns, people were still searching for stuff on the Wikipedia, maybe also kind of being more interested in scientific information or stuff like that. The thing to keep in mind from that is there are cyclical patterns, and you have to keep them in mind when we want to interpret data coming from Wikipedia. Okay, what is then this data that we can actually get from Wikipedia? There's basically 4 types of data that I think are the most important. The first, you might all know, basically articles, their text, the links they contain, the categories they're classified into, and Wikipedia really makes this data comprehensively available over time from past versions and so on. There's also a lot of data on edits, basically on the level of individual edits, version to version text changes, who made these changes, in some cases the IPs of these users, what did they say about this? More interesting maybe for political scientists are page views, and this is, I think, what is most widely used. So basically how many people clicked on an individual article on each day. And then the probably least well-known data source is navigation data, because Wikipedia also publishes aggregate dyadic clickstream counts. So basically, like when someone was on page X, did they click on page Y? And this data is only published in the aggregate, and only if more than 10 people in a given month click on basically take part in this dyad. So this is published as a monthly aggregate data set, which kind of gives us a peek into how people navigate the Wikipedia. So we can basically summarize this data, most of this data, as a type of digital trace data. So following the definition of how it begins, basically Wikipedia data is found data. So it's not data that comes from us thinking of a question that we'd like to collect data on, but it's basically a byproduct of processes that we're interested in, like looking for a political candidate on Wikipedia, forming an opinion on a controversial policy issue by looking up some facts about this issue. So it's found data that we have little power over. It's event-based data, so it's not based on, for example, stable attitudes like survey data, but basically there's only something recorded if something changes. So if I have always identified as a social democrat, for example, I wouldn't be looking up social democracy on Wikipedia because I already have a strong conception of myself. But if I start having doubts, or if I change my conception of myself, I might look for information on Wikipedia. And it's longitudinal data. So it's basically data that is available over time, which complicates the structure of this data a bit. There's, of course, other digital trace data in political science, but I think even that type of digital trace data is a bit different from Wikipedia data. Much of it is either social media, that basically people have used quite widely to generate measurements of political behavior and so on. But the issue is that social media is really only used by a small group and a much smaller group than, for example, Wikipedia. The other data that is gaining in popularity is browsing behavior data, which I think has many advantages. For example, that quite often we can combine and link it with survey data, but it's a very costly measurement that many people, for example, me being a postdoc at a European university, just can't afford. And here I think Wikipedia kind of presents a sweet spot of offering a lot of data on interesting processes that kind of a wider share of the population takes part in, and that where the activity is maybe less demanding than posting something. It's just looking something up. However, Wikipedia research has quite often focused on rather technical aspects. So much of this research comes from computer science, from network science, and so on. There's a little bit of sociological research, but it is really focused on editor communities rather than readers. And I think, at least for political science, the readers of Wikipedia are much more interesting than the people who edit Wikipedia, because it's just a larger community. So Wikipedia data differs significantly from data that is typically used in the social sciences. And I think this is something that bars many people from using it. Nevertheless, there are quite a few political science applications that have come out in the past years. And of course, I don't want to leave them unmentioned. Also, to give you a bit of an impression what these different types of data have been used for. Articles have basically been a subject of research in political science for quite a while. I would say that originally much of this research was factual. So basically there were assessments, how correct is Wikipedia? Can we use it to gather knowledge on politics? Recently, I think a lot of this research is moving over to Wikidata, which is basically a structured version of the Wikipedia that is much more easy, that can more easily be read with machines. There's also increasingly a turn to study articles not as something that is a neutral representation, but something that contains bias. Most of this research has focused on gender bias. So how are women portrayed differently than men? How are the articles about women embedded differently in the Wikipedia than men, and so on. Much more interesting, I think we are much more kind of, new and promising is research on other aspects of Wikipedia. This holds, for example, for edits. They have been investigated quite a lot in sociology, mainly on kind of community-centered approaches, so who interacts with whom, but also edit wars and which topics become contentious. However, in Wikipedia, my literature review has only identified a single study that really addresses kind of political implications of this, and this is a study on strategic editing that basically argues that the electoral cycle and so on can tell us about when politicians are more likely to engage in strategic editing of a Wikipedia article. A third aspect is research on page views, and they've been used quite widely as indicator for different things. For example, on interest, for example, in policy issues, but also in candidates to measure their viability. A second aspect has been to try to predict vote choice and support for certain candidates from Wikipedia page views. And a third aspect has been information seeking and exposure to information based on article visits. I think this literature is quite interesting, and the degree of sophistication really varies. So I've, of course, shown very good examples on the slide, but generally there's a lot of kind of conceptual questions that come up when we try to interpret the visit to a web page as an indicator for something. And I return to that a bit later on. The fourth type of data, so with clickstream or navigation data, has so far been mostly used in computer science studies that really focus on how people navigate web pages. In political science, there's not really any applications. There's a few that relate to political science topics. So for example, how knowledge bubbles might kind of shape political polarization by basically steering people from one article to another article that leans to the same side of a policy issue. However, this type of data is really underused so far. Okay, how can we then, or what should we then consider when we want to contribute to this literature, or how can we make inferences from this type of data? Basically, I'm following this total survey error framework that has for decades guided survey researchers in how to make inferences. And what I take from it is mostly two types of inferences, namely that when we want to look at data and generate something from it, there's two processes. The first is the process of measurement, where we're basically trying to generate statistics that adequately reflect the data that we have before us. So for surveys, this would be, for example, also coming up with a question and so on, which of course for Wikipedia is not relevant, but I think the process of translating a concept into a statistic is still important. And the second aspect is the problem of representation. So basically, when we have generated our statistics on the process, how can we generalize this to a wider population of interest? This, of course, has also been applied to digital trace data. I have two references here if you want to look this up. But what I'm taking from it is really mostly this big question of these two types of inferences. The example I will use throughout the talk is gender bias in the perception of politicians. Basically arguing that there's a big literature on gender bias in media reporting about politics and politicians. And we know that there's both quantitative and qualitative biases. So women tend to, in some situations, receive less, in others receive more coverage. They are described in different ways, different aspects are emphasized. For a long time, there was a lot of hope that online spaces where stuff like networks with journalists matter a bit less might be a good opportunity to overcome these biases. However, we've also seen examples of really, examples of a backlash against women online. So I think it's an interesting space to study how gender in politics is developing. It's also a very convenient example for me because there's a lot of systematic and structured data on legislators on Wikipedia available that researchers who are interested in this type of questions can draw on. So what I'm trying to address is how does the online representation of female and male politicians differ? So how do their articles differ? But also how do Wikipedia readers use the articles on female and male politicians and how do they differ in this use? Let me first talk a little bit about measurement. So this process of coming from a construct, selecting things that represent the construct, and then measuring something from that. Basically, I'm focusing on three types of concepts that I argue are the most suitable to measure with Wikipedia data. Of course, you could come up with different concepts, but I think for many reasons, these are kind of more easily distinguishable from other alternatives. They cover quite a lot of interesting applications, especially in political behavior and political communication. And I think here we can be more confident in making inferences. The first is representation and bias, basically asking how are topics and people represented on Wikipedia and which biases maybe exist in these representations. The second is interest and attention. So what are users interested in on Wikipedia? And the third is framing and stereotypes. So when they are already on the Wikipedia, what shapes usage patterns? And I will talk about each of them with an example on a slide. First, talking about representation and bias. I think the most important step in this is to come up with a proper conceptualization of this, because when we think about how a person is represented on Wikipedia, on the one hand, there's knowledge about the person or the issue, but there's also potential biases that might be in this representation. Typically, we solve this by a comparison. So comparing female to male legislators, for example. On Wikipedia, of course, we can do the same. So we would select article content or the article embedding in link networks. So this is kind of the traces that we select. Having thought about the concept, in the concept, we need to decide things like what does bias mean to us? So is it just about, for example, the mentioning of certain things? Is it about the attention that is dedicated to this person, and so on? So this can be quite a complex and multifaceted concept. In actually measuring this, I think this is where the bigger difficulties start, because while we can draw on typical text as data and network methods, Wikipedia has a lot of unique kind of platform affordances that make this text quite specific. So, for example, all of these articles are very much focused on biography. So while in press coverage, we would focus on things such as, is the family mentioned and how much is it mentioned? By default, many of this information that we're looking for in biased coverage is already included even in these info boxes on Wikipedia. So in many ways, we need to refine the concepts that we bring from other fields of political communication and studying media coverage in order to make them fit for Wikipedia. So it could be about the amount, for example. Many studies have also looked into adjectives, which is also not so much present on Wikipedia. Instead, what is more promising are things like describing specific, like looking at adverbs, looking at how specific actions are classified, and so on. One of the things that I think is also important is to focus on selective mentions and omissions. So what is not in the article, what is in the article. So basically creating an objective standard and comparing that to this standard. A second construct or a second concept that we might focus on in our research is attention and interest. And I've mentioned that a lot of research that has so far been done on Wikipedia has focused on that. So basically looked at attention to events, attention to specific policy issues, attention to specific people, for example, legislators. Sometimes event-based, sometimes long-term. Recently, specifically these event-based studies, basically similar to the survey design, unexpected event during survey fielding designs. Similar things have been done on Wikipedia because just the data is available on a daily basis. What I find most interesting here is to kind of think about the conceptual clarification of what does it mean to study this from Wikipedia articles. So one of the key discussions in the literature on this is the differentiation between attention and support. And that's something that we also find when looking, for example, at research on Twitter data or research on Google, that basically just searching for something or visiting a specific page doesn't equal support. Rather, it's searching information, and it's typically happens in a process of opinion change. So some of the studies I've listed here basically discuss the possibility of measuring vote choice from Wikipedia data. And I think the biggest takeaway from this literature is that it's not so much the vote choice by default that we can model, but it's rather change in, or not even change as an outcome, but the openness to change one's vote and to consider a specific party, either because we don't know much yet about that party or because somehow new facts have come to light. So basically, by considering this and building it into the concept that we want to measure and thinking about what exactly is it that we can model and reconstructing the process by which the data of visiting a page is generated, we can turn this weakness that we can't measure attitudes into a strength, that we can measure kind of the considerations that people make on the way to potentially changing their vote. What I think is the strength of Wikipedia data in this, in comparison to survey data that of course offers these attitudes that we're really after, is that we can look at a broader selection of articles and we can apply different theoretical or empirical considerations in combining them. And I think quite often different articles basically offer us a different view on the same phenomenon. I've put an example here on the left with that basically is time series data on 3 articles where of course selected a bit arbitrarily, but I've also done this systematically in a class with students to look at different concepts that are all somehow related to the hashtag #MeToo movement around the timely vicinity to the movement. And we can see that basically for Alyssa Milano, who you kind of popularized this hashtag on Twitter, for sexual harassment, which was the issue behind this, and for maybe the meta issue, gender equality, we can see quite different patterns. So for Alyssa Milano, there's a general pattern of attention that fluctuates. And it also goes up quite a lot in this specific moment, but it then really goes down and attention goes away from her as a person. It's not so visible since this is daily figures. In a monthly figure, it would look much more impressive, but for gender equality, we see the opposite pattern of basically a slower increase, no spike at all on the day itself, but then kind of over a longer time, the interest remains sustainedly higher. For sexual harassment, we also see a bit higher interest in the post period, but we also have this huge spike. So basically different kind of aspects that are closer or further from a specific concept can tell us different, we can combine them in order to gain a fuller picture of what an event caused. So basically what we can try to do when we generate measures from this is to combine multiple time series and with that disentangle different aspects of a concept. The third type of concept I want to talk about is basically the concept of interest and framing framing and stereotypes. So when people visit the Wikipedia, their behavior is shaped by different factors. On the one hand, by framing, so how the Wikipedia page itself frames a certain topic, but also by stereotypes, so the preconceptions that they themselves bring to the Wikipedia. Of course, we can't look at both at the same time. We have to keep something constant. So typically we would focus on one type of variation. But the process is quite similar. Usually we would obtain clickstream data, so this navigation data, and try to pass and classify this. I'm showing you an example here on the left, which is basically the clickstream of the page of Angela Merkel aggregated over a period of, I think, roughly 2 years. And I've classified the links that people most frequently follow from her page into categories where basically everything in pink is related to her family. So this is her husband, this is her dad, this is the place where she lives, and this is the village that her ex-partner is from. So really quite remote subjects for her, which are all among the top kind of links that people click on. In blue, we see her office, we see her cabinet, we see her party, and we see her successor in office. In yellow, we see a gesture that she typically used to do, the so-called Merkel-Raute, and also a necklace that she wore at some occasion. So kind of political trivia in a way. And we can basically with this come to a more detailed picture of what people are interested in when they already read about Angela Merkel. What is the stuff that they want more information about? With this, we can then calculate some property of interest, for example, the amount of outgoing clicks on the husband per visit to Angela Merkel's page. So this is basically the third concept that I think is interesting to study from this data. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So just to sum up, there's these 3 types of concepts. For each of them, I think we can come up with a mechanism that I've completely oversimplified here, where Wikipedia content is either a reflection of specific biases and representations, where Wikipedia might be an outcome of an event in the real world, or where things like our stereotypes or the framing on the Wikipedia determine how people then behave on the platform. Depending on that, we might want to study different outcomes, and we will apply different methods in order to kind of process the data to really generate a statistic from it. Let me use the last minutes to also talk about the aspect of representation. So how can we then make inferences from these statistics that we've generated? Basically, I think when thinking about what Wikipedia is representative for, we need to distinguish between, on the one hand, considering Wikipedia as a context, so studying behavior on Wikipedia. In these cases, we are typically interested in the population of users, for example, the readers, the editors, or a population of subjects. So for example, how are specific politicians represented, how are specific activists, issues, and so on represented. In these cases, I think it's mostly a question of the relevance of the context Wikipedia. The other kind of approach that is sometimes taken is to use Wikipedia as a censor. In this case, I think we're getting into a bit iffy territory, because similar to other digital trace data, we can't really know how representative or not Wikipedia is of the population. What we can, however, do is emphasize that there's a large user base, even though we don't know the specifics about it. So especially for kind of mechanisms like stereotypes and how people translate kind of knowledge about a person into what they then follow up with and so on, this might not be such a huge issue. So basically for this, we need to discuss critically in our research, what is the representativity of Wikipedia for this specific question. So basically I would argue that Wikipedia content and edit represents Wikipedia editors and what the world then reads. They can also represent article subjects. So this is the what the world then reads part. This is the representing editors, so studying the community. And in some cases, but very limited, Wikipedia page views and click streams may also represent the wider online population. And all this is, of course, always conditional on a specific set of pages that we're studying. So we typically study content or edits of a specific set. Since this is then so central to kind of making these inferences, I thought I wanted to focus a little bit more on that as well in the talk, and how we get to select a set of pages that we obtain our measurements from. For well-defined populations, like the population of legislators in a specific country, we can simply measure coverage. So we can assess who has a Wikipedia article, who doesn't. This is typically determined by things like notability, but at least in large countries, most people will typically have one. For weakly defined populations, so for example, when we want to study activists or when we want to study policy issues, things become a bit more tricky. And here, so far, the literature has used inductive sampling strategies, mostly sometimes deductive. So basically using Wikipedia categories or lists. In the paper, I propose other strategies as well, like using linked pages or using textual similarities to a core page that is kind of at the center of our interest. I can talk about that more in the discussion if you're interested, but basically all of these start from Wikipedia content itself. What instead I'd recommend is deductive sampling strategies. So some people have used keywords, for example, but also very clear-cut inclusion and exclusion criteria help to basically determine what is for us representative of a specific concept. And only these deductive strategies really allow a thorough assessment of coverage, because as soon as we start from the Wikipedia itself, we can never really get an overview of what is not covered on the platform. When we've kind of come up with this general sampling frame of pages that we want to study, the last step to consider and to critically assess also in research is how much we're able to generate measurements for each of the units. And there's really strong constraints on this. So for articles, for example, it's the length. I think, yeah, I have an example here that basically shows for the legislators of several different countries what is the average length in number of words in the native language of these politicians that are actually available. And you see that when we study the US, we will hardly ever have problems with that because we have a lot of information on each person. This is quite different when we study smaller countries that maybe have also smaller community of contributors. For clickstreams, similarly, basically page views to a page are the ceiling. And here, for example, I included a quantitative overview of how many of the members of parliament in the Bundestag, so the German legislators, are included in 23 months of clickstream at all. But for many, we don't have coverage for each of the months. So only about 18% are included in each month, just because most politicians are not prominent enough for us to have comprehensive coverage. So basically kind of addressing these biases and also trying to explain them by internal and external metrics, such as how often do people actually look these people up, is a crucial step in us discussing how much we can even generalize to a set such as all politicians. Okay, let me conclude. Basically, I've tried to outline 3 core concepts: representation and bias, interest and attention, framing and stereotypes. And I've tried to point to 2 types of inference that we're trying to make. So generating statistics that reflect the data, so that say something about the Wikipedia pages that we've selected, and representation. So generalizing from these pages to a larger population of interest, be that Wikipedia readers, be that kind of the online representation of politicians. How should we then use Wikipedia? I would basically make 4 suggestions. One is that I think Wikipedia is best used as one type of evidence in applied research. So even though I'm talking about how to use Wikipedia, I'm not recommending this as an good for everything and always strategy. I think on the one hand, it can provide first exploratory evidence, or it can help to generalize from, for example, experimental data to a more broader population. So basically combining this data with other data sources is important. A second aspect is using Wikipedia as a platform to generate data. And this has been used primarily by economists. I think I can talk about this more in the discussion, but this is something I view with quite some skepticism because, of course, it's also an open source platform that we shouldn't involve too much in our research. But this has been a key resource to showing the relevance of Wikipedia for real world behavior, with people strategically basically systematically changing small aspects of an article and looking at outcomes. The platform content can also be used in researcher-run experiments, basically just as high quality and adaptable stimulus content. And I think generally research should focus more on the underexplored data types. So edits, clickstreams, other data sources from the Wikipedia family, such as the structured data sources like Wikidata. Trying to conclude, I think Wikipedia data comes with a lot of limitations, and I've highlighted them throughout the talk, but the data is basically a byproduct of processes that we're interested in, that it has an unknown user base and not a lot of demographic information. It's aggregate data, so we can't really make conclusions about individual users other than editors, and the platform is itself subject to change in its history since 2001. However, it also provides a lot of opportunities. Some of them are common to digital trace data. So the fact that it basically continuously generates data, the fact that this data is non-reactive, so it's not a response, that it's time series, and that it has a global reach. However, some are also specific to Wikipedia. So this idea that people trust this much more than social media because it has this encyclopedic approach and credibility. Its relevance for political behavior by covering, for example, politicians and so on. And its structure that makes it really easy for us to engage in comparisons and to find specific groups. And finally, it's much more comprehensive data sharing that basically gives us data on who produces this content, how many people read this content, and what is in this content. Is really something that is quite unique to the platform. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Theresa, for that presentation. At this point, Theresa Gessler is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. If you wish to be recognized and ask your question via audio, please indicate this in the Q&A text box or by clicking the raise hand button. Otherwise, I will read your question aloud during the Q&A period. And we do have a question that came in during your talk from Thomas Ball. He asks, Google Trends offer trends over time in selected keywords similar to the time series shown for Alyssa Milano in your presentation. Is Wikipedia data similar to Google Trends insofar as time series information is readily available, or does Wikipedia require a separate download for each time period in an analysis?
Yes and no, I would say. So it's similarly easily available, that you can, there's an API that you can access quite easily and collect a lot of data from it. It's worse in one aspect, namely that we can't differentiate by country, which is one of the kind of key advantages of Google Trends. But it's much better in another aspect, which is that for Google Trends data, we basically always get this data scaled to a relative point. So it's very difficult to kind of make objective comparisons. There have been people who have tried to develop algorithms how to scale this data appropriately. But what we get from Wikipedia and what we don't get from Google is really raw numbers for how many people have visited a certain article on a certain day.
I want to follow up on something you mentioned about measurement and how it relates to representation. So if I'm going to try to measure, for example, gender bias using articles from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which I think still exists, I know how the EB is created, right? There's an editorial board which makes assignments on topics to various people who then write the articles, and they're edited, and then it's put together in a volume. And so you can talk about, okay, there's bias in the selection of topics, there's bias in how each individual writer generated the article, and then how it was edited and clipped. On the other hand, Wikipedia is much more of a well, it operates differently, and let me give you an example. So there was a story a few years ago about how there's a guy out there who really hates the term comprised of. So he hates it when people say, universities are comprised of faculty and students, right? He really likes the term comprises instead of comprised of. So he's developed this bot, and he's basically made it his full-time hobby to change all articles to say comprises instead of comprised of. And even though he's not really correct in a linguistic sense, he's just so he can't be defeated because he's willing to devote whatever amount of time and energy it takes to make sure he gets his way. So if I look at the distribution of comprised of versus comprises, if I was doing a linguistic study of the English language and I tried to use Wikipedia as a corpus, I would get this very misleading view, because this freaking nerd is like spending his entire life to prosecute this agenda, which is, and no one's willing to fight him on it, right? Like, why would you? So, my question, that was a long-winded way of saying, my question is, what are you measuring when you measure, for example, how women are talked about versus how men are talked about? Like the process by which an article is created and edited, and if there are edit wars or some sort of disagreement, how consensus is reached or not reached. I'm not even sure what the data generating process is.
So maybe this is a bit of a sidebar, but on the first question, so where I have actually been studies that looked specifically at gender bias on Wikipedia and in the Encyclopedia Britannica, comparing them. There the topic was mostly who is included, and I think what they ultimately found, I can't remember, it's been a while that I've read it, but I think they ultimately found that Wikipedia cover significantly more women, but also just in part because Wikipedia is so much bigger. But so in many ways, these two sources can actually be compared and have been compared. On the question of what are we measuring, so I think what we ultimately measure is, on the one hand, the emergence of a consensus. And there, of course, that we just don't want to say anything anymore against this guy could be an element, but there's many things on which people are actually given contrast. So, for example, how standards of notability are implemented is something that kind of these feminist movements active on Wikipedia are actually actively contending. So kind of, what is the consensus that emerges at the end is one of the things we're measuring. But I think from a more pragmatic perspective, we are measuring what people are consuming. So I think what ends up in a person's Wikipedia article is much more likely to be known than what ends up in a newspaper article about that person. So in a sense, I think what we're measuring is really what people encounter. And when we look at a more specific point in time, I think there's much more of these kind of redundancies or nuances, and it's much more about how consensus changes. But I think the relevance of this content mostly comes from the fact that it's consumed so much and that so many people read it. And I mean, by now, so especially with the emergence of Wikidata that structures this content, this Wikipedia content is reused, for example, in Alexa and so on. So when we ask our phone, when we ask Google a question, the answer we're getting is very likely from Wikipedia. So what makes it on there? Not so much the question of whether it's comprised of or comprises, but what is contained in the article, I think, is what is interesting and what tells us something about the representation of politicians, for example.
The reason I brought up that weird example, other than just being kind of funny, is, you know, we study linguistic evolution looking at texts, and it's kind of a new thing that one person or a very small group of people can have such an outsized impact if they wish to. They can't change the entire corpus, but on all topics. But if they focus on one thing, they may actually be able to do that. And that actually kind of leads to my other question, which is the whole people trust Wikipedia because of this sort of Condorcet jury theorem argument that enough eyes are looking at it and enough of them are correct enough that the consensus that emerges will be something proximate to truth. On the other hand, I had a friend in college who would go to mathematics articles and subtly change the theorems so that they'd be wrong in ways that were not easily detected. And we also have now state-sanctioned organizations that are attempting to shape the discourse through posting to message boards, and I assume Wikipedia has to be at least some part of that. And like I just said, if you're willing to put enough effort into it, you can actually make a big difference, because you can just, you can just outlast your enemies, so to speak. So to what extent, I understand, like this could be more about what people are encountering. How does the possibility for malicious editing or perhaps at least motivated editing, how does that change how we should think about the data that come from Wikipedia?
Mm-hmm. At first I was going to say, I think this is very relevant for IR, for example, but thinking about it, I think it's also relevant for kind of more like political behavior, comparative politics, which is more my field. But I think in general, it's true that probably we see a lot of attempts of influence organizations kind of in the international sphere, that also domestically, I've mentioned this study on strategic editing that basically kind of adds favorable information or tries to remove negative information from Wikipedia articles. And there has been a study that I think I didn't mention on my slides by Kalla and Aronoff, who looked at how long does it take that factually correct but negative information gets removed from the pages of politicians. And what they found is that basically there's a positivity bias. So the self-correcting function on Wikipedia works much faster for information that is negative, even if that information is true. So I think clearly there's kind of community dynamics involved in this. I hope the wrong equations would by now be detected automatically, but I think these social processes are something that we can't get rid of, but that we have to assume them as being there. Maybe I can also, returning to your previous question in which you talked about bias, I think one of the interesting things that I found in trying to look at the biases in the representation of female and male politicians is that actually I think the bias is mostly, it's not so much among politicians, but it's really across fields. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that women are portrayed differently on Wikipedia. But if you look at politicians specifically, this bias is much smaller. It's difficult to locate. In many countries, female politicians actually have longer articles. They also get more views. So what I think is really the driving mechanism is that we just cover different women. So women portrayed on Wikipedia are much more likely to be dancers than scientists, for example. So I guess kind of this is where the bias lies. Yeah, and
I mean, it's also a function of attention, right? So, it would be really hard to change, for example, the article about Joe Biden to say that he's not really the president, right? Because so many people are watching that. On the other hand, the mathematics articles are not being watched as closely, and it's a lot harder to detect a problem. You also see this with languages, right? I would venture to guess that the Russian language article about Ukrainian territory disputes, I would guess it's different than the English language article, just because there are more people looking at the English language article and they're different people. So it kind of, there's actually another story I can think of with Wikipedia where Jimmy Wales, one of the people who started Wikipedia, edited his own profile to try to claim that he was the only person who invented Wikipedia. And it led to this big protracted dispute with Larry Sanger, who co-created it. And even today, I don't know if Jimmy is doing it, but I still see edits on that article that are very suspicious. Like somebody will say, oh, Time Magazine said that Wikipedia is a testament to the vision of one man, Jimmy Wales. And then it gets taken down like 3 weeks later. It's like, what's going on here? So it's, it's one of those things. And that's something that gets a lot of attention because it's the creator of Wikipedia. So lots of people are looking at it. That might go completely undetected if it's like, a state legislator from the U.S., right? Who's looking at the Wikipedia page from Georgia's 12th district? I don't know. I guess that was more of a comment.
We we analyzed the representation of Swiss politicians for a Swiss NGO, and the way we interpreted kind of these articles was really as the outcome of, on the one hand, representation by people who are motivated to write Wikipedia, and that's a very particular community that's male dominated, that has a certain level of education, that is more likely to have certain jobs and so on. And then kind of a level of also involvement of people close to these politicians. And the study of edits that I mentioned earlier on, for example, they systematically look at edits from IP addresses from parliament. And that exists for quite many countries, that there's Twitter bots monitoring basically what Wikipedia activity comes from inside parliament. So I think, this is a relevant phenomenon, but I think it's similar to kind of the role of bots in social media. That is something we have to, that may bias our estimates, and we have to be careful and aware of that. But we also can't really entirely exclude or something.
Well, I don't see any more questions in the window, so I am going to thank Theresa for being our presenter this week. I want to remind everyone that the presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share it with a colleague or watch it again. I also want to invite you to join us next week, February 25th, when we will host a talk by Mark Ratkovic at Princeton University. His talk is entitled Relaxing Assumptions, Improving Inference, Utilizing Machine Learning for Valid Causal Inference. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Theresa, thanks very much for being our presenter today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I hope to see everyone next week.